Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, which is an opportunity for us all to discuss how social dialogue can ensure that the green transition is just for everyone and leaves no one behind. So this webinar is also accompanying the release of a Global Deal thematic brief on this topic, on the role of social dialogue for the green transition, which was prepared with contributions from our partner ADAPT. And some of the examples that we will be discussing today, that we have invited experts to discuss with us, are included in the brief, which also has a broader number of examples from different parts, different countries in the world. And so just a very brief introduction from my side, just based on the brief. So we all know, I think, that a just transition is a concept that has taken more and more the headlines through the ILO's guidelines for a just transition. But it was actually developed first by US unions and environmentalists in the 80s. So it's actually going back quite a few decades. It became, again, it entered common use for us, for economists, for social scientists who look at the green transition, thanks to the ILO's guidelines, which were issued in 2015, the Paris Agreement, which also talks about the just transition, that's also in 2015, and the 2018 Silesia Declaration on Solidarity and the Just Transition. So the concept really relates to the idea that success in the green transition really depends on how the extent to which we can ensure participation from everybody, inclusiveness, particularly in the gains brought about by the green transition, social dialogue, all guided by the key promise, the key targets of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The brief underscores the role of social dialogue, so that's what really distinguishes this from other works on the just transition as a means to achieving this social cohesion behind the green transition. And social dialogue is important for many reasons. I mean, some of the costs related to the green transition are related to job losses. They require, the green transition requires to be successful upskilling and reskilling policies, active labor market policies, and in all these contexts, the role of social dialogue is very important. The legitimacy and the effectiveness of active labor market policies are ensured through workforce consultation and cooperation. We all know that the social partners play a key role in upskilling and reskilling policies, also in assessing how skill needs are changing and feeding through government policies into different actions. And also they play clearly a very big role in the management of job losses, the limitation of job losses, and the management when they happen. The brief, as I said, presents various examples from the global north and the global south. Clearly, what comes through is that there is no one size that fits all when we are talking about the green transition. And we'll hear from many of these examples today. So there's many differences across sectors, across countries, across different occupations, but it is what comes through very clearly. It's very important to ensure a gender responsive and inclusive just transition at every level of development and in every country. There's basically four interrelated and mutually supportive elements that come through, which are very much in line with what the ILO Action Framework for a Green Transition that was developed in 2023 says. And they are promoting inclusive, sustainable, and job-rich growth, ensuring social equity, managing processes, and also financing the just transition. And then the brief also wraps up with common takeaways from the different examples, recommendations for how governments, social partners, and in various other institutions and stakeholders can help make social dialogue more effective in the context of the just transition. So let me now move on to the speakers. Our first speaker is Andrea Garnero, who is the Green Transition Coordinator in the OECD Directorate for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs. It's a pleasure to have Andrea with us, who will set the scene before we welcome and hear about so many examples of good practice. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll try to share my slides in full screen mode. So now you should see the slides in full screen mode. So first of all, thanks Glenda and the Global Deal for the opportunity to set the scene briefly of this important webinar and say a few words on the role of social dialogue in the green transition. So it's very timely, this webinar. COP28 is bringing the world together at a critical moment for climate action. The net zero transition is a necessity. I think we all agree with that. But this will imply enduring macroeconomic and sectoral structural transformation that creates some tensions. And a key concern is related to the impact on the labor market and the reallocation that the mitigation policies will entail from high emission sectors to low emission ones. So to manage this reallocation, we need to have the right set of policies in place, and I'll try to argue in my presentation today, we need strong social partners and social dialogue. So first of all, just let me remind that the green transition is not the only one, is not the only transition that labor markets in OECD countries, but of course also in the rest of the world, in the global south, are experiencing. There are many other transitions that are taking place at the same time. Of course, we have technology, robots until recently, and now we see the generative AI and artificial intelligence more in general starting to enter into the workplace. Then we have a restructuring of the way globalization used to work, with global value chains and some degree of reshoring or so-called friendshoring. And finally, our societies, at least in the global north, in OECD countries, are getting old. This will change demand, will reduce the number of people in the working age, and therefore change the way we work. So this, I think, led us to ask which jobs will exist in the future, how, where, and by whom will they be carried out, and which policies are needed to shape and not just follow the transformation. So a key concern, as I said, is related to the labor market. Let's be honest, the green transition is not going to be a walk in the park. This is a chart from the recent OECD Skills Outlook that has a chapter dedicated to the green transition, and in particular to the European Fit for 55 package. And the colleagues, they show that there will be a significant reallocation depending on the sector. So you can see, for instance, in green, highlighted here on the right in green, the significant growth that is expected in the renewable and nuclear electricity sector. On the other end, you can see in red the significant decrease in employment that is expected in fossil fuels extractions and distribution sector and fossil fuel powered electricity. However, these sectors are sectors that employ a small share of people. So the green bar is the share of people employed in million in 2019, whereas the dot is the change with respect in 2023 with respect to 2019. And you see, so there are big changes in small sectors and there are small changes in big sectors, but of course small changes in big sectors still mean millions of people that will need to find a new job, or at the very least change the way they work. Another important element to be kept in mind is that the effect of the green transition will not be the same everywhere and for everyone. So these are very much preliminary results from our ongoing work on the effect of the green transition on the labor market. And you can see on the left that there is a strong gender dimension. So both green-driven occupations, so all those jobs, not just the green jobs, all those jobs that will be needed and in demand because of the green transition are mostly to be found among men, or more to be found among men than among women, but also the greenhouse gases intensive occupations, those that sometimes are called brown jobs. There is some divide in terms of age, with older workers concentrated in greenhouse gases intensive occupations, and in terms of education. And the same in terms of geographical areas. So we see that both green-driven occupations and greenhouse gases intensive occupations are more likely to be found in rural areas and less in urban areas. But the issue is that they are not necessarily the same places. On the right, you see a scatter plot of regions in terms of the share of greenhouse gases intensive occupations and green-driven occupations, and you see a substantial variety. So there are some regions where there are both low green-driven occupations and green-intensive occupation with respect to the national mean, and regions where there are both a lot of them. But there are also regions on the top left of the quadrant here, so this square on the top left, where these are regions where the share of greenhouse gases intensive occupations is higher than the national mean, and significantly higher than the share of green-driven occupations. So these are regions, and these are quite many regions in Europe and the United States, so states in the US, where the transition is going to be more difficult, because the gap to be matched between greenhouse gases intensive occupations and green-driven occupations is relatively larger than elsewhere. So you can see that there are challenges in terms of workforce groups as well as geographical areas, and these are issues that we have to keep in mind when designing policies. And finally, we have to expect that the cost of reallocation for those workers that will lose their job from greenhouse gases intensive sectors may be sizable. So this chart again shows is based on ongoing work for the next year employment outlook, and it shows the earning losses after displacement for workers displaced from high greenhouse gases intensity sectors, so sectors that pollute, that emit a lot, have a lot of emissions, versus workers that lose their job from sectors where greenhouse gases are relatively low. And you see that in both cases, displacement entails a significant loss in terms of earnings that can go up to 50-60% after the loss of employment. However, this loss is about 10 percentage points higher for workers that have been displaced from greenhouse gases intensive sectors. So the cost of displacement is going to be big, and is going to be bigger for workers from greenhouse gases intensive sector. The gap is not really explained. The gap between the two, between the, let's say, the green and the brown sectors, is not driven by lower employment probabilities, but by a larger wage gap, meaning that workers in greenhouse gases intensive sectors come from sectors that do pay well, enjoy significant wage premium. And there is the first place where the role of collective bargaining, more specifically, will be key to ensure that these workers may get, or at least strive to get, the same pay and benefit packages that they had in the previous job. As I was saying, this is not the first transition that OECD labor markets are facing, or labor markets across the world, and therefore we do have some lessons on past transitions on which we can learn. First, it is important to anticipate the challenges. In particular, in the case of the green transition. The green transition is different from the other ones, the technology, the globalization, and aging, because it's largely driven by policy decision. So, this calls for an even stronger responsibility in ensuring that no one is left behind, because this is an intended policy decision. And second, it is possible to involve stakeholders, including, and I would say starting from the social partners, to anticipate the challenges and design the green transition. So this was the first lessons that we learned in our work on displaced workers that I think is still very much valid in the case of the green transition. The second one is about timely and targeted intervention to provide job counseling and training services to those workers that may lose their job. And I think a key issue here is timely means not only when people lose their job, but in fact before that job displacement happens. So the best programs for displaced workers are those that anticipate displacement and take a step forward in helping and guiding workers to retrain, reskill or upskill and move on to new job opportunities. And third is that policies to help displaced workers require the entire government, the so-called wall of government approach, not just labor market policies. And this is even more the case, I would say, in the case of the green transition. In particular, I think we have to think how to help communities at large and not just individual workers, because as I said, there is a strong regional and local angle of the green transition, and therefore it's not enough to help one worker or few workers, but to help the entire communities, thinking about place-based policies, but also housing policies and housing relocation. So what is the role of social dialogue and social partners in all this? I think there is a role. I say this based on the analysis and the reflection that we have made on the work on displaced workers, but also on the years-long work that the OECD has done on social dialogue and collective bargaining. I think there are three main areas where social partners are important in the green transition. First of all, I think that social partners can be extremely helpful in designing sustainable transition based on their experience on the ground. So social partners, unions, employers organizations, never forget that of course it takes two to tango. So having employers on board, employers organization is key. It's important because they know what happens on the ground. They know the challenge, the specific challenges. They can come up with their own plans to reduce emissions and make the green transition sustainable. The second important role is that social partners have already proved, not only they can, but they already proved to be able to manage transitions on their own. There is a long-standing experience in some of the OECD countries of social partners in anticipating structural change, providing timely and targeted interventions, and designing supportive policy. I'm thinking here about the job security councils in Sweden, but also other programs in Germany, Austria, or training funds also in Italy. So a different set of countries where social dialogue and collective bargaining plays a significant role, of course, but where social partners have instruments already in place to manage structural change and transformation. And I think we can leverage on these existing institutions and potentially even somewhat expand them, export them elsewhere. Of course, it's never easy to export models, social partnership models in other countries, but I think we can build and take useful inspiration from that and use social partners to manage the transition. And third, possibly the most important point, is that I think that without social partners, the green transition is unlikely to happen. So the green transition is not just a set of regulation and requirements and incentives. So the green transition is first and foremost a societal challenge that requires to be widely understood and accepted and shared. And so this is why having on board trade union organizations and employers organizations that represent millions of workers and millions of companies is a precondition, in my view, to make it happen. As I was anticipating before, next year employment outlook will look at the impact of the green transition on the labor market with 4 chapters looking at different angles, from the characterizing the jobs that are concerned, looking at job displacement, looking at the skills required for the green transition and the distributive effects of climate change mitigation policies. We're also fielding right now, so this very moment, so I think we will have to do a second webinar, a second seminar later in 2024 with countries, but also with trade unions and employers organizations to understand which are the policy tools and the instruments that unions, employers, and countries' national governments are putting in place, both to accompany, from the social and labor point of view, the climate change mitigation policies, but also what they are doing to adapt the labor legislation and labor practices, work practices, to a changing climate and increasing temperatures. For instance, adapting health and safety regulations, which are certainly a key issue, a key instrument in ensuring that workers can work in proper working environment and proper working conditions. So with this, I'm done with my overview of the work. More will come in the OECD Employment Outlook. And as I said, we will look at various policies and social dialogue, social partners, collective bargaining will be certainly at the center, because this is an immense task that we believe governments alone cannot bring it home without the help of social partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you for the excellent overview of what are likely to be really quantitatively the implications for of the green transition and mitigation policies on, across occupations, across industries, the rural dimension that you mentioned, which is extremely relevant to many countries, and also for highlighting the role of social dialogue and some of the examples you brought to us in your presentation we will discuss now. So Samuel Engblom will talk, I think, precisely of job security councils, the various transition packages in Sweden. Samuel is the former state secretary of the Ministry of Education and Research in Sweden, and will present, as I said, some examples coming out of Sweden related to the role of social dialogue in the just transition. Samuel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Glenda, and thanks to Andrea for a very good setting of the scene. See how I'm just going to share my slides here. Yeah. Can you see them? Yes, we can. Well, first of all, what I will do is I will share some Swedish experiences on how to use social dialogue to achieve just transition, including then the most recent major reform, which is this agreement on flexibility, adaptation, and transition. And I would say that as being a small open economy, Sweden has had to handle structural change due to trade, due to technological change, and now most recently due to the need for a green transition. And this is something that the social partners have had to handle for many decades. And recently, I think, what I will do now is I very simplified. I will give you the past 50 years of collective bargaining on transition in Sweden. Starting out in the 1970s, when we got our employment protection legislation, it said that dismissal for economic and organizational reason is automatically a just cause for dismissals. Courts will never question that. There's no provision for any mandatory social plans or anything like that exists in some other countries. But there is still in the legislation the last in, first out principle, sort of a seniority rule, which decides which workers will be laid off. And this provided trade unions with a leverage to negotiate with employers, because employers might want other workers to stay on in order to ensure the productivity of the company, for example. And this was the beginning of negotiations regarding then acceptance from the last in, first out principle. And this was often done in exchange for transition support for the people who were laid off. And this was something that was bipartite and on the workplace level. Then in the late 1970s, we got the first collective agreements on transition. And these are sectoral collective bargaining agreements covering, for example, almost the entire private sector, the municipal sector, the central government sector. Today, these say that 0.3% of the wage sum should be set aside in foundations to fund economic security and transition support for workers that are laid off when there are dismissals for economic and organizational reasons. And this is done through these job security councils that Andrea mentioned that are bipartite bodies. So here we have something which is bipartite and on the sectoral level. In 1982, we got something, once again in the private sector, called a development agreement. And one part of that development agreement is that employers should provide, at their expense, the training made necessary by the introduction of new technology. And this was, once again, a bipartite agreement and done on the sectoral level. Then in 2021, we got this agreement on flexibility, adaptability, and security. And this was negotiated by the private sector social partners, LO, PTK, and the Confederation of Industry. This included changes in employment protection legislation, improved transition support, the new generous student financing for lifelong learning, which I will talk more about in my next slide. And the construction here was legislation supplemented by collective agreements. And like I say, the new thing here compared to the other three were that this is something that individuals can use to anticipate change. When it comes to the collective agreements on transition, they are aimed at people who are laid off, whereas in this case, you can stay on your job and still use these benefits. And here we had a sort of new way of doing things. So we had what I call a bipartite design with tripartite implementation. So this reform was designed entirely by private sector social partners. And then they went to the government and said, look, we have agreed on this package, which includes legislative change, which you have to decide on, and collective agreements to supplement them. And if you do your part, we will do our part. But this was really sort of dictated by the social partners. And this was due to very particular economic circumstances, political circumstances that I cannot not be able to explain it in this webinar. Then we have this, as I mentioned, the finance scheme for transition retraining. And this is very generous. The benefits are 80% of your former salary. And then this is the public system, and then there are, it has a ceiling, so there are collective bargaining top-ups to that. You can study for between 1 and 44 weeks full-time, but it's possible to study between 20 and 100%. So if you study 50%, you can study for 2 years. And there's also a pre-existing right to a leave of absence for studies, which is important in this respect as well. To be eligible, you have to have worked at least 16 hours per week during each calendar month for at least 8 years during a framework period of 14 years and 12 of the last 24 months. So this requires that you are quite established in the labor market, that you have been on the labor market for at least 8 years, working at least half time, maybe a little bit less. The planned studies must improve your position in the labor market. And this is something which is decided by the Job Security Council. So you turn to your Job Security Council, and then they write an assessment to the government agency which is responsible for paying out. But here the social partners sort of retain this possibility to interpret the rules this way. And this report is on a first serve. There is a limit to each year, and it means it's a first come, first serve basis, you could say. Now we're moving into the next step, because in order to make this work, of course, there must be educational content that suits these new possibilities. And what I've tried to do, this is actually what I'm working on currently, is to find a way to illustrate this need for reskilling and upskilling. And on a horizontal axis, you can see it's kind of a logarithmic scale regarding the length of the education. So 1 week, 2 weeks, 5 weeks, 10 weeks, 1 semester, 2 semesters, 4 semesters. And then on the vertical axis, you have the content, whether it's general or specialized. And these new possibilities can be used for different purposes. If we take, you can, for example, if you take this circle B here, you can use it to go to university and get a master's in battery technology. Required that master's not more than 1 year of study, sort of full-time equivalent. And here we have a problem that maybe some courses are longer than that, but I mean, still 1 year, you can do a lot in 1 year to add a new level to your prior qualifications. You can also use it to change occupation. I mean, part of the reallocation that Andrea talked about, it could be using vocational higher education to switch from a high greenhouse gas sector to a low greenhouse gas sector. Or for people that are laid off, for example, if we have graduates being laid off, we have programs where they can become teachers in 1 year, and we have a severe lack of teachers in Sweden. If we look at the possibility to update with the latest knowledge, this E here, then there, I mean, of course, this could be a way of getting the latest research in fossil-free steel or from energy technology out into the workplace in a faster way, with courses that are, between just a couple of days and maybe up to 1 semester. And this is also an area where, of course, the employer's responsibility for upskilling, which I talked about earlier from the development agreement, is important. And it is something that you can actually do without, as part of your occupation. And then there are also people that might need to retraining to change or broaden their tasks. We can have accountants that need to work on sustainability, for example, and they also need somewhat shorter courses. When we have looked at what we know so far about the demand, there is demand for higher education and higher vocational education. There is a clear preference from working people for flexibility in shorter courses. And this is, I think, my final point. We need increased social dialogue between social partners and the job security councils and educational providers about the content and form of education. We need sort of our next step in social dialogue in Sweden will be social dialogue between social partners and universities, which goes back to my previous occupation as state secretary responsible for higher education. So I think we sort of taking this to the next level, we need to talk about the educational content. I will stop there, and I hope I didn't speak for too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samuel. This was extremely interesting, and particularly interesting to see how these transition packages also include the element of upskilling and reskilling. And as you say, as a result, the importance of having a next step, which is the discussion between the social partners and the training providers to adapt the content of the training to the needs of the green transition. And now it's a pleasure to give the floor to Bill Mutoro, who is National Assistant General Secretary of Transport Workers Union in Kenya. And Bill will give us the example of how social dialogue in Kenya played a key role in making the transition, the just transition possible there, particularly as with the example of the introduction of a new transport system in Nairobi. Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Glenda, and it was really interesting presentation from Samuel and Andrea, and quite a lot to learn from. So I want to talk about the process of introduction of the bus rapid transit system, the BRT in Nairobi, how it was conceptualized, the process of social dialogue, and the status of where we are today. So just a brief introduction is public transport. First of all, Nairobi doesn't have a public transport, and what happened is we are having quite a number of minibuses, that are operating under private hands, but they are organized into transport company because that was a directive by the Ministry of Transport to try and organize the informal transport that had become very chaotic and was being run by criminal gangs. So in terms of employment, the sector employs about 600,000 people nationally, but then the employment is informal. The drivers, the conductors, and the whole workers who depend on the transport value chain are working without employment contracts. Employment is based on a willing employer and willing employee. The wage system is what we call the wage system is a fixed rent contract, what we call the rate system here, such that the owners lease these vehicles to drivers. Then upon the conclusion of a day, the drivers are supposed to remit a certain amount of money back to the owner, what is called the target. And then the drivers get to keep what is remained over and above the target. The drivers also have to work for long hours to ensure that they are making enough money to get fuel to continue tomorrow. So briefly, before the introduction of the BRT transport, briefly about the structural issues in informal transport in Nairobi. On one hand, we have a government failure in terms of regulation, general regulation, the issue of labor rights. Workers don't have a representation because their employment status is informal. But then we are having serious cases of police harassment and extortion, what we call polite bribes, and they are very open on the road. Also, in terms of the industry itself, the industry has oversupply of vehicles, and this is part of the reasons why the government thought about the BRT system, because there's no regulation into the number of vehicles that are getting into the sector. But then also the issue of non-transparent employment relationships and the target system. They push workers into extreme competition, and this leads into aggressive driving, long working hours, overspeeding, and fatigue. And all these causes result into social costs, which is poor services that the citizens of Nairobi are getting, overcrowding in terms of the vehicles on the road and long traffic jams, road destruction, corruption on the roads, and also emissions. Now, generally all over the world, cities in developing countries like Nairobi, Dakar, and Abidjan are being encouraged by World Bank and the national governments to adopt BRT. They say that BRT will ease congestion, increase efficiency, and also reduce air pollution. But from where we sit as a union, we recognize that learning from the experiences in other areas, for example, South Africa, where they have a good BRT system, is that they are losers and winners. But a big issue for us in Kenya is how informal transport workers are going to be affected. Like I said initially, the sector employs around 150,000 workers in Nairobi, but then 600,000 nationally. So the proposed BRT in Nairobi was initiated by the government of Kenya in around 2018, and the funding was coming from World Bank. So what the government did is, recognizing that transport in Nairobi is under private hands, they had to bring on board the owners of the public transport vehicles as stakeholders. Workers and their unions were never involved in the initial stages of the planning and design and also ownership. As a result, What we did as Transport Workers Union, of course, in collaboration with other unions within the Road Transport Division, is through the support of our global union federation, that is the International Transport Workers Federation, ITF, we began by commissioning a research, which was called the Labor Impact Research. And it was carried out, of course, with the support of the Global Institutes, Manchester, and also the Institute of Development Studies, which is an academia consortium here in Kenya. So the objectives of the research, which was a starting point, was, first of all, we wanted to understand the impact and the implications of BRT for transport workers in general. What are the best practices from Sub-Saharan Africa on engagement and inclusion of workers' organizations in the development of the BRT policy and implementation by local, national, and international decision makers? Also, the nature of worker groups that was going to take part in consultations going forward, because workers are operating in an informal employment relationship. So that means there is very little trade union presence in the public transport in Nairobi. But the workers themselves have organized into associations and majorly welfare groups just to support each other on welfare issues. We also wanted to understand how a consultation and negotiation process will take place, who are the target groups, how do we build alliance, and how do we run a campaign? And finally, what will be the outcomes of including workers representatives in the design and operation of BRT? So the process of the research, of course, was spearheaded by academia, but then the unions took central parts in organizing focus discussion groups, field research, and engaging with the workers. And the report was launched in January 2019. After the launch of the report, we were able to identify the main demands. Of course, there were quite a number of demands, but broadly, they were under three thematic areas. The first one is inclusion and representation. The government had already constituted an agency under the Ministry of Transport called the Nairobi Metropolitan Area Transport Authority that was going to oversee the design and implementation of the BRT program. Then secondly, our demand was on labor impact and just transition for informal workers. Of course, from our research, we realized that 300,000 workers who depend on the matatu value chain. There are other informal workers who depend on the matatu value chain. They are going to be impacted negatively, and as such, we were demanding for just transition for these informal workers. Also broadly, as part of improving public transport in Nairobi, we saw an opportunity in formalizing public transport in terms of employment relationship, so that even as we welcome BRT, let us also ensure that the existing public transport is formalized so that we can have a better transport system for Nairobi. So after these demands, we put them in a position paper.
Hello, Bill. I think we lost you for a moment. We can't hear you.
Are you able to hear me? Apologies.
Yes, we can hear you now. We can hear you now. We can no longer see the slides, but we can hear you.
Oh, apologies. I think there was a problem with the network, but let me just go back again. Yes. Are you able to see my slides now?
Yes, we can see the slides now.
Thank you. Yes. So after the demands, we drew up a position paper with the help of experts, and we mobilized transport workers in the whole of Nairobi. Of course, using our logistical powers, we were able to block the roads using our vehicles. And then we organized the procession to the Ministry of Transport, where we delivered the report as well as our demands. This report became a very important guiding document in terms of formulating strategies going forward on how we were going to undertake social dialogue. First of all, it helped us identify how we were going to organize the informal sector workers. Which strategies were we going to use? Because for us to have a strong voice in pushing for our inclusion, we had to have very strong union presence in the informal Matatu sector. But then also the document helped us to identify how to do lobbying in terms of government, both the two levels of government. How are we going to build alliances with non-state actors? And how are we going to run a campaign? In terms of lobbying and alliance building, of course, lobbying, we were looking at the government, but at the national level, we are looking at the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of Labor, and also the government agency, the Nairobi Metropolitan Area Transport Authority. But then also, being that the project was bringing on board other 5 counties that border Nairobi, which is a second level of government, we had to ensure that we hold meetings with all this, with the leadership of all these counties, educate them on the labor impact, and see how we can be able to build alliance. Under non-state actors, of course, academia was very critical to us in terms of supporting research. But then we also had other NGOs that were pushing for a socially just public transport. And as a result, we were able to build an alliance and jointly form a working group. So this is briefly a map of Nairobi and the bordering counties. These are meetings that the leadership of the union held together with the 5 bordering counties of Nairobi. And then finally, we had the General Secretary of our union held a meeting with the CEO of the Nairobi Metropolitan Transport Area Authority and educated him on why it was important for workers to be represented in the board. Under non-state actors, we were able to organize town hall meetings under the Socially Just Public Transport Working Group, which brought in board the workers were represented, the representatives of the owners of the vehicles were part of the meeting. We also had the National Police Service in terms of traffic regulation, and also the commuters or the residents of Nairobi. So what were some of the outcomes of the social dialogue that we had? First of all, in terms of formalization of public transport, the ministry agreed to form a task force that was tripartite to begin the process of review of the existing policies and see how we can be able to develop policies that will match the labor market for public transport in Nairobi. Also to ensure that we root out the issue of police bribes and corruption on the roads. We began the process of digitalization of payments in public transport and see how cashless payments can be a way to reduce corruption. Because part of the reason is money is being, money is flowing in cash, and that is a recipe for corruption. But then we were also able to agree on industry regulations between the unions and the employer organizations through collective agreements. As a step towards formalization, we were also able to achieve social protection coverage for Matatu workers. This was critical because it was part of formalization and also identifying workers who are working in the sector. We pushed for the constitution of the Namata board, and this came when we wrote a protest letter to the World Bank because the project was being funded by World Bank, but workers were not being consulted. They had been left out. So after a meeting, we were given a promise that once the term of the current board comes to an end, workers will be able to be represented in the board so that our issues can be able to be addressed. Then lastly, we were able to develop an upskilling and reskilling program for existing Matatu workers to ensure that they become competitive in the BRT jobs, because BRT was also coming up with new and better jobs. But of special focus was women, because women have greatly suffered. They have been harassed in the existing public transport, and so the BRT was an opportunity for them to get decent jobs. However, along the way, the project, dramatically stopped. We don't understand whether, the funding from the World Bank stopped, or maybe the government misused, the officials misused the funding, but the project stopped. And that, became a very big challenge for us as a union. But then, of course, during that time also, we were having transition of government. We had a new government that was coming into place. And this year, the European Union signed an agreement with the government of Kenya on a new green BRT project. So that means that as a union, we have to start over again. But of course, there were critical lessons that we had already learned. Of course, also increasingly with the green BRT project is the electrification of matatus. We are seeing an increase in local manufacturing companies for electric vehicles in Nairobi. And also we are developing as a union an organizing strategy. Of course, collaborating with our sister union from the metal sector, we have built an alliance to ensure that we are having just transition from manufacturing to mobility. Thank you very much, and that is my end.
Thank you very much, Bill. This was extremely interesting, again, to give us examples from a very different context, and also a context of high informality. And I found it very interesting how you were able to federate, to bring together the informal workers, and also to, of course, be represented, to have a voice, and also then, as you were saying at the end, to try and ensure that they were able to get a slice of the cake, let's put it this way, through upskilling and reskilling, and how they could potentially apply for BRT jobs. So it was a very interesting experience, I think, to hear about. And now the floor to Devan Pillai, who's head of employment strategy at the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa. Over to you, Devan.
Thank you, Glenda, and thank you very much to the presenters earlier. They've made my job a lot easier, and also served to provide a good basis for which to present the PCC's work. I just want to take a step back, and just for colleagues that are not aware, just to give them a brief on the Presidential Climate Commission, which was established by the President of South Africa, who also chairs the commission. The commission is made up of a range of stakeholders, which includes our cabinet ministers, those ministers' portfolios that are affected by the just transition. It's made up of academia, a large component of the private sector that are directly impacted by the transition, a range of civil society organizations, which include, amongst others, women and youth. All of our large federations are represented on the trade unions by very high senior elected officials, and as well as the civil society and civil rights organizations linked to the climate agenda. The fundamental role of the PCC is to encourage dialogue amongst the various stakeholders to reach broad consensus on our transition. And deeply imbued in the business processes of the PCC is the element of procedural justice. And I think I'll speak to that in a bit. The presidential, and let me first indicate that I'm from the secretariat of the PCC, and I'm not one of the commissioners. So the Secretariat serves the commissioners, and our work is largely revolves around informing the leaders of government and business. We rely a lot on research, which allows us to then provide evidence-based policy recommendations. And a significant component of our work is trying to build this general consensus, not just at the secretariat level, but all the way down to a community and at grassroots levels. And I'll speak to that a bit in terms of our partnership implementation model that we just recently introduced. So the PCC released very recently something called the Just Transition Framework for South Africa that provides the broad policy environment under which the just transition is implemented. It starts off by defining the just transition and providing a context for it. It speaks very strongly of the three justices that are to be implemented through the transition, which is your procedural justice, your distributive justice, and your restorative justice. It goes further to point out what we consider sectors most at risk. And through this transition, we're aware that almost all sectors of the economy is at risk, but it flags those 4 sectors that we consider to be most at risk. And we've then demonstrated the extent and scope of that risk and a response to that. And it concludes by speaking through an appropriate governance structure for the just transition, and then lastly deals with the financing of the just transition. So deeply embedded in the workings of the PCC as well as the Just Transition Framework is how do you go about bringing the effect of justice within this transition? And those that are aware of South Africa, we have an aging coal fleet of power stations, and our industries have a very high level of fossil fuel dependence in our economy for energy. So the transition is embedded in 2 ways. One, we need to transition away from fossil fuel to renewable. And the second is, how do we respond to the climate change? And in South Africa, the impact of climate change has been quite stark in the last 4 to 5 years, with significant flooding in some regions, and in other regions, we've had severe levels of drought. What this has brought about is a more accurate appreciation by broader society of the impact of climate change, and an understanding that we need to transition, and we need to transition as soon as possible, but at a pace at which the country is able to transition. So how do we go about embedding the just component is very critical, because the transition itself, and just simply relying on stakeholder engagement, and based on your methodology and your approach, you may not necessarily embed the concept of justice. And what the justice speaks to is as everyone has spoken to previously, is leaving no one behind. And leaving no one behind entails ensuring that workers that have lost their jobs are able to find new employment, or if not in the formal sector, in some sort of livelihood opportunities. 2 is looking at the skilling requirements of workers, upskilling and reskilling to re-enter the labor market, or participate in other forms of economic activity. 3rd thing is to look at, you would obviously find in South Africa a number of workers willing to migrate to other areas of the country due to the opportunities that will emerge in those areas. So our coal sector is the one sector that we found to be most at risk. And this is our ground zero in the province of Mpumalanga, where 2/3 of the province, 2 out of its 3 districts, are adversely impacted. Almost all households rely on the coal value chain. You have 1 worker per household supporting up to 5 to 6 members of the family in that particular household. You find low levels of employment, low levels of skilling, and economic opportunities are very limited to the value chains linked to coal. So part of this just transition entails developing the economies, diversifying the economies, looking at new industries, looking at new value chains that could be developed, and critically looking at what other forms of economic activity that communities can participate in. So the just transition in Mpumalanga is significantly different from what you would experience in other provinces such as Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, Western Cape, where the energy transition itself is a net benefit for all of the other provinces. But in Mpumalanga, there's a net loss, and a significant net loss. So it's critical that when we are engaging in the just transition, we understand this dynamic and apply these dynamics accordingly. The reskilling and upskilling challenges in South Africa has been something that's chronic in the country. We've never been able to significantly transition skilling to actually meet labor market demands and occupations that are required. So there's a constant voice from the private sector that says there is insufficient skills. So over the last year or two, there's been a slow transition as well as a slow appreciation of the need to transition our skilling ecosystem to speak to occupations of the future and current occupations that's required, identify the trades that are required for those occupations and the skills that are required to meet that, and then train accordingly in order to meet demand. So that kind of initiatives have started. It's part of our just transition. And these initiatives are largely driven by the private sector and by the civil society organizations with support from government from a policy environment. So how do we engage with civil society and how do we engage with unions in terms of this just transition? So the PCC has released a number of strategic documents that speaks to financing of the just transition, as well as speaking to adaptation and resilience issues, documents that speaks to our energy security. The process followed thus far is the projects are conceptualized, a draft report is produced. This is then socialized very deeply and at a community level all the way to a senior level within government in order to get a broad understanding of the views of all stakeholders. Those views are then deeply embedded into the document. And a final version of the document is then presented to government as a policy recommendation or a strategy. Very recent and our most that we've done is a report on the Komati power station that was recently shut down, not necessarily as a result of the just transition, but largely because it's reached its end of life and economic life. But that closure happened in this particular period in time when the just transition became a hot topic. And because of its sudden closure and insufficient planning, that town took an immediate direct dive economically, as well as socially. So the PCC had gone into the town, engaged extensively with all stakeholders, developed a report on the shortcomings of this closure, developed a recommendation, took the recommendations back to the community to test these, took it back to other stakeholders such as the private sector, the labor unions, incorporated those inputs that have come through, and then presented that to the president in terms of this is how we should transition going forward in terms of a closure of a power station. So it's somehow becoming a blueprint of how we begin to close our power stations and shut down our power stations and repurpose our power stations. So that's been a very important document, in recent life. But what we've also found is at times you find that communities feel excluded when they are not part of developing the solution. We've now developed a new concept called a partnership implementation model that seeks to bring in all of the relevant stakeholders, starting from a bottom-up approach to identify solutions to problems. So I did mention Mpumalanga, and I did mention there were 2 districts that were adversely affected by coal. We refer to them as our coal belt. We do know there's a dire need for an economic diversification to take place within that particular communities. So the process will now run where the PCC goes in, we begin to consult from a ward level all the way up to a local government level with all stakeholders. Then from a local government level, consolidate towards a district level, and then develop and identify projects at a district level to allow for economic diversification, industrial diversification, that will hopefully have a broader impact in terms of those economies. How that rolls out is each stakeholder is consulted independently. They all identify a key driver, a key person to drive their initiatives. We then create a second layer of a committee that's made up of these leaders and these key drivers. They then consolidate a plan, which is then taken to the district. Local government plays an important role in this. So does the provincial government. And this plan is then embedded in what we have in South Africa called a district development model. And these development models is what brings together change at a district level. And it is funded by all three tiers of government. So if we're able to get this methodology embedded, it's actually a co-creation model. Deeply embeds all stakeholders, and everyone is deeply invested in the process. So it goes down and includes DFIs, it includes academic institutions, it includes private sector, the NGO sector, etc. So this model has been very unique. We're piloting it at the moment, and if we find that it's a good blueprint, a best practice will then be developed for its rollout nationally in the implementation of the Just Transition Framework. Amongst others, it's not just, sorry.
No, I think, we're running a bit out of time, but I'll let you conclude, Devan.
Sure. Thank you. And I was actually concluding. So that's just one example in terms of an economic diversification. Very similar kind of methodologies will be run as part of the Just Transition, and this is the just element, is to bring in the forms of social ownership. In South Africa, there's a very skewed levels of ownership in the country. The majority of people are excluded from the economy. So we have now developed this concept of social ownership, and these, using the same partnership implementation model, will then identify intervention points where communities, workers, youth organization, women organization can begin to actively participate across all of the sectors of the economy and begin to own components of the economy. So this is how we as South Africa are envisaging responding to the just transition, not just in terms of consultation, but deeply empowering society, community, and workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Devan. Thank you for bringing the example of South Africa again, and particularly these last few examples you've given of how you're trying to implement the just transition through this partnership and the local dimension. Kan Matsuzaki is our last speaker. He is Assistant General Secretary of Industrial Global Union, and because Industrial is a global union, they have a very broad overview, and they've taken direct action by issuing also guidelines for their members, but they've also have a very broad overview of what's happening in many of the countries where they are present. So we're all keen to hear from Kan. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Glenda. I just want to share my screen now. Let me just... Okay, so...
Yes, perfect.
So those of you who don't know about Industrial Global Union, as Glenda mentioned, we are the global union who are representing 50 million workers from 140 countries in various sectors, including energy, mining, and manufacturing sector. So we are the one, I would say, the one of the most affected the unions from climate change or new technologies such as digitalizations, AI and automation, robotization. So we are very much concerned about the how we can achieve this just transition process. So what we are doing right now as Industrial Global Union is we try to properly guide our members to how the union, the workers, can be on the track on the process of just transition in their sector or in their countries. So this is one example. We have issued one trade union guide, which called Preparing for the Global Transformation Driven by Climate Change and in the Industry 4.0. We have issued this guide back in May 2019. And the main reason that we actually issued this paper is that, we wanted to redefine what does just transition mean to the workers and to the union nowadays who are affected by climate change and Industry 4.0 technology. And also, we wanted to make sure and what will be our concrete demand. Then we set up, three concrete demand at that time. So one is, of course, the social dialogue, which, the previous speaker already mentioned the importance of, social dialogue. So the social dialogues means not only the company level, but the sector level, national level, regional level, and international level. So we would like to make sure that the workers' voice who are impacted by climate change or Industry 4.0 is to be heard in the decision-making processes. So in concretely, we are actually demanding a permanent institution should be established regarding just transition in each countries. Then through the just transition, we actually continue to demand sustainable industrial policies and plan, which of course, including creation of decent jobs and of course, access to the jobs. Then those sustainable industrial policies should include not only the energy transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy, but those renewable energy should be affordable to the all people. So this is kind of our demand that, this is an important point. Then followed by this labor market adjustment programs, of course, our workers, the union will be heavily impacted by those changes and transitions. So we need to have proper upskilling, reskilling program, and also the proper social protection. But ultimate goal is, of course, should be to create at least one new decent job, not precarious job, but decent job for each each job lost. So this is kind of mainly our demand. So after we issue this guideline, and this was 4 years ago, then over the last 4 years, we actually conducted some kind of education program to our affiliate. Then I think many of our affiliates now knows what is the just transition all about and the importance of just transition. But when we conducted survey to our affiliate, it was quite amazing result that almost 42% of our affiliate union said that there's no just transition discussion in their country because of either political or economic reason. So most of these 42 affiliate unions is located in the global south, in the developing countries, especially in the growing population countries. So this is kind of our challenge, how the Industrial Global Union can properly guide those unions in the global south, especially in the growing population countries, to adapt those changes and how to start the process of the just transition. So this is why we actually issued the second version of the guidance, which called a trade union guide of practice for just transition. So we issued this guide of practice last year, October, which consisted of 2 sections. So one part of this the guide of practice consists of the reality of the economic and political status of just transition. We in the Global Union has quite many cases, as a good cases and bad cases of just transition from each countries and each sectors. I will not go into that detail, but there is also success stories how the unions, the workers, the sectors in the industry could achieve the just transition process over the last 10 or 20 years. So we actually introduced those kind of reality in the first section. But most important part is actually the second part of this just transition guide, which provide steps to how the union can follow to structure a successful just transition effort. So, which means that, as I said, the 42% of union, they said that there's no just transition discussion exist in their countries. So this guide actually guide our union to how to start this just transition discussion in their countries. So we actually provide, kind of timeline for the 2 years timeline. For the first years, of course, start beginning from the assessment and where's the finance resource, where's the human resource, on how they can dedicate, on the daily work on the just transition. They create a committee for the just transition, then followed by the training campaign for the members, and how we can also train trade union leaders as a spokesperson for on behalf of the union members for the just transition processes. Then expand those union the training processes to the publics. Then year number 2 is kind of focusing on lobbying activity to the government and the company, then how to promote the collective bargaining as well as social bargaining to achieve the proper just transition plan in the future. And also, we provide the checklist in this guided practice and how they should gather proper information in the future, and how they should analyze those the information, and also how they should establish coalition with other communities, politicians, or other trade union leaders, or gather economic data on the wages, benefit, pension. I think this is very important in terms of wages, because imagine that if the fossil fuel workers should convert into renewable energy workers, can they maintain their good wages and benefit or not? So this is also the very critical part. And also structuring the just transition demand. What should be the proper demand in terms of just transition to the government and to the employers, and also structuring internal work for the just transition plan. How the union should make a campaign, how they structure the research, negotiation, education, finance, and the media strategy, and also, of course, internal training. So those are the checklists that we provided to them. And of course, in the course of a just transition process, they need to know whether they are on the right track or not. So these are the indicators, whether the majority union members support leaders' approach to the just transition, or is this the union can engage with the government and company to agree on the just transition plan, and they or the union has successfully negotiated its right to be an equal partner with equal voice and equal vote in the local and national just transition negotiation, and so on and so forth. So these are the kind of the steps that we are providing to our affiliate. And from this year, we will conduct a proper training on how to use this kind of practice to our affiliate, especially in the Global South Union, in the developing country. But we have faced, new challenges, because, as you know, in this just transition processes, the supplier, the key player, has been changed quite quickly. For example, when you develop a renewable energy supply chain, there is totally new company that then those companies are your new negotiation partner, and the existing company, they are having spin-offs, acquisition, mergers, So while the workers not prepare for that, the things is happening. So the biggest question is who will be our new negotiation partner in the company, and who will be the key player who actually dominating those renewable market and the new technologies. And unfortunately, we've seen a lots of workers' violation, anti-union attitude from the quickly emerging company in the renewable energy sector or the new technology sector. So this is kind of our challenge. And also the biggest question is, again, how we can provide a decent job to the growing population countries like India, Indonesia, when they create, the energy transition processes, whether those the jobs will be created enough decent job to observe these young workforces in the future. So this is also the biggest challenge that we need to think about. But again, our ultimate goal should be to create at least one new decent job for each job lost. So so I stop my sharing screen now, but this is kind of the Industrial Body Union is doing as a training to our affiliate on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khan. Thanks a lot. It's been extremely useful. I know we're a bit over time, but I think it's been extremely interesting to hear from all of you and to learn from the good practices, but also hear, how you've been able to overcome some of the challenges. I mean, Khan, you were just mentioning something I personally hadn't thought about, but the partners with whom unions are negotiating are also changing because of the emergence of new industries. So this is a big challenge. We heard from Bill also about the informality in the particular example that he was bringing, and how in a context of informality is difficult in fact to have a representation in the context of the just transition as well as in other contexts. I think Devan brought many interesting examples of good practice, but also I think in particular it made me reflect on the regional dimension, on the local dimension, and how having initiatives that leverage all the local partners is important. And of course then we heard from Samuel how in the case of Sweden, in many cases the initiative came directly from the social partners and then became a tripartite agreement once they were able to involve the government. Maybe I do have a question that I'll ask everybody to answer very, very quickly, which is, how in the context of social dialogue, how difficult it has been, or it is, or how difficult do you envisage it to be, to bring together different interests, right? So on the one hand, of course, there are growing new interests, new markets, new opportunities brought about by the green transition. So for the private sector, obviously, something positive and potentially also growing employment. But then on the other hand, you have workers that need protection, and that obviously comes at a cost. And so how difficult has it been to reconcile these sometimes opposing interests? And is there anything in the just transition that has brought the parties together, or maybe it is even more difficult in the context of the just transition? I'll give the floor to Khan first. You were the last speaker.
Well, I think this is a very difficult question, actually. I think it only the things that we need to have is proper social dialogue, to solve that kind of question of interest. But nowadays, it's very difficult for the workers in the many places because geopolitical changes all over the world. According to ITUC's human rights index, rights index, almost 80% of the country is violating the basic workers' right, which is right to collective bargaining and right to freedom of association. So this is our biggest challenge, because without freedom of association, without right to collective bargaining, how can be the union can raise our voice, raise our interest to, to that social dialogue system. So I think, this is kind of the crisis of democracy all over the world. So I think we need to really think about, how we can bring this back, the democracy and right to collective bargaining and freedom of association. So because this is actually the basics for just transition processes in the sustainable future. Otherwise, I think inequality will be gaining, continue to gain. So.
Thanks a lot, Ken. And Samuel, you're the next on my screen.
Thank you, Glenda. Well, I have actually 2 points. I think, first of all, I think the green transition is not that different from the transitions that we have seen over the past 100 years, and which the social dialogue has been an important tool to make function. So when we've had, if I look at Sweden, transition due to trade, due to technological development, and now green transitions, and that way it's no different. But I think one thing, of course, what we have to deal with here are some new industries, some new companies that can create a lot of goodwill from the fact that they are part of the green transition. And I think it's important that that goodwill should not be interpreted in a way that makes them not accountable in other ways. I mean, right now we have a conflict in Sweden between Tesla, the electric vehicle company, and trade unions that want them to abide to the same rules that all other companies in Sweden do. And of course, from some quarters, you've heard the argument, oh, look, the trade unions are against a green transition because they are, but I think luckily that has been a minority view. I mean, most people see through that and said, okay, this should be not a company because they were a forerunner electric vehicles should not be allowed to operate under other rules than those that apply to the sort of mechanics across the street from Tesla. This is all playing out about 400 meters from my house, actually. So it's interesting to see it there. But I think that's sort of 2, I think, points that I'd like to make and that I hope can inspire others.
Thanks a lot, Devan. You're muted, Devan.
Apologies. Thank you very much. I was saying this is quite a contested area, and both colleagues that spoke previously they flagged this. But I think it's important that if we're able to correctly plan and sequence events, we'll be able to minimize the level of conflict between the relevant parties. So, and also it's important to empower those that do not have the resources to be empowered. And this is not just a labor and a private sector initiative. This is a whole of society initiative. So as part of the planning is understanding those that can be reskilled and upskilled and that can transition to other economic sectors, understanding those that may not be able to transition and developing an appropriate social protection system for them, and linking that to other forms of economic activity. So that's been our kind of direction in which we're moving in South Africa, just to try to address those areas where we find there may be difficulty in finding workers, alternative forms of employment. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. And over to Bill now.
Yeah, thank you. Once again, and my thoughts would be, this transition is happening at a time when we are seeing a lot of attacks on labor. The collective bargaining structures in different countries, has been broken down. The power of unions has been reduced, and so this puts workers, at a more disadvantaged position. But then also, it is very, very much important for unions to go back to the basics in terms of organizing and building labor power, because we understand that we can only have our position in collective bargaining when we have a lot of labor power. So it goes back to the unions in terms of organizing, but also coming up with new strategies in terms of alliance building, especially non-state actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Andrea, did you have anything to add?
It was just a reflection, also building a little bit on what Samuel mentioned, the fact that social partners have been seen and sometimes are seen in the past as resistant to change and resistant to, let's say, to the green transition. I think a specific challenge for social partners and social pacts and collective agreements, and that I think they will be under the spotlight more than in the past. So while usually this may have been an issue, let's say social dialogue, collective bargaining for some specialists and maybe the labor ministry in a country, now the need and also, let's say, I think the vocation to use this tool, social dialogue, to make the green transition happen will make it more salient from a political and a communication point of view. The usual geography of allies and enemies, they are not enemies, but let's say less allies, let's say, may change. Environmental activists may start to look at what unions and employers are doing, and I think this will require some fresh thinking on the side of employers organization and trade unions, because the usual people they speak to and the usual language they speak to may also require to change. So I think this is certainly interesting times, at least from an analyst point of view, to live and to see what will happen.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, Andrea. And I think also there is more and more, and you know, we see it every day, we hear about it every day, but also an interest, especially by the young, but also by the not so young, in you know, value in work, and you know, the greening of employment processes is one big element to attract talent. And so, if there is one thing I would like to add, I think actually Devan very briefly pointed to it. There are shortages out there, skill shortages, including related to the green transition. And although they are not necessarily a good thing for the economy, they are a big impetus, I think, for employers to keep their talent, and so to invest in the workers they have, try to upskill and reskill rather than fire and rehire, as they've done sometimes in other transitions where in contexts where social dialogue wasn't very strong. So my hope is still that something comes out of these shortages we're seeing everywhere, in terms of more openness to again invest in smoother transitions for the existing workforce. Thank you very much. This has been an extremely interesting conversation. Thank you very much, everybody. This is also the last of our webinars for this year, the fourth in the series that we've organized, but we'll be back next year with more webinars and more on more interesting topics. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Evening, wherever
Bye-bye.
you are. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.